Hello, everybody. This is Jane Mangold at Montana State University, and this webinar is focused on integrated weed management. So thank you for joining me. Just a little bit about myself. I'm an associate professor at Montana State University, and I am the extension rangeland weed specialist. So I focus on dealing with invasive plants in range and pasture across Montana. I would like you to take 15, 20 seconds or so and just jot down the name of a noxious weed or perhaps another weed that you're dealing with that isn't noxious. Go ahead and just jot that down, and we will return to that a little later on in the presentation. Okay, hopefully you have something jotted down, and we'll get going. As I mentioned just a few seconds ago, I mostly deal with invasive plants that are on the state noxious weed list. Some of those are shown on this somewhat beautiful slide. Many of these species are quite showy and attractive. There is a species down there on the lower right slide. That's cheatgrass, and just to note that cheatgrass is not a noxious weed in Montana, but it is a very invasive plant that is impacting rangelands and croplands as well, but probably a bigger issue in rangelands. So these are just a few of the species that I'm thinking about as this presentation goes on and we talk about integrated weed management. So these species have a variety of impacts on rangelands. They can reduce the forage production, and they can reduce crop yields as well if you're in a situation where they're impacting croplands. They can reduce native plant diversity, which can subsequently decrease wildlife habitat quality. Many of these species present a fire risk. I'm thinking particularly of the annual grasses like cheatgrass. Some of them can also increase soil erosion in range and pasture. Some can change how soil nutrients are cycled, and some of them are actually toxic to humans, livestock, and wildlife. So that's another reason that some of these species are placed on a noxious weed list. How much are these noxious weeds costing us? There have been analyses done over the years looking at the impacts, the economic impacts of noxious weeds. In the 90s, some work was done specific to the impacts of knapweed and leafy spurge in Montana and the Dakotas. And at that time, the knapweeds were costing Montanans about $14 million annually. These were both indirect and direct costs. Some work done with leafy spurge suggested that it was costing Montana $18 million annually. A more recent study in Oregon from 2014 that looked at, I think it was 28 different noxious weeds in Oregon and projected that they were impacting the state at a cost of $83.5 million annually. There has been a lack of good information in more recent years. However, we did do an analysis more recently. This was something that I worked on with Kate Fuller, Stacy Davis, and Matt Ranella. And what we did was we looked at the impact to livestock producers that were grazing livestock on private rangeland. So we conducted a survey and combined the results of that survey with some empirical data from field studies. We had 182 responses across 45 Montana counties. And I'll just show you a couple results from that analysis. This graph is showing those noxious weeds that are having the largest effect on livestock production on private grazing lands. Just notice that leafy spurge, Canada thistle, and knapweed, we saw anywhere from about 17 to 18% to over 25% of our respondents identifying those species as having the most impact on their production systems. And this is pretty typical to work that's been done earlier as well. These three species remain very problematic across Montana. We also asked respondents to indicate to us which weed control strategies they are using right now. And chemical control was by far and away the most popular way to manage noxious weeds. About 85% of our respondents indicated that they use chemical control, followed by grazing and biological control. We were happy to see that about almost half of our respondents are using integrated weed management, so using more than one of these strategies at a time. And many of them were a strategy combined with chemical control or the use of herbicides. Respondents did give us some indication of what they were spending per acre to use these different types of control. After some number crunching, we arrived at the average annual cost, including labor, was about 91 cents per acre to manage these noxious weeds. So the average size of a grazing area in our study was just a little over 5,000 acres. So if you take that 5,000 acres times 91 cents per acre, the average respondent was spending about $4,500, $4,600 for noxious weed control. Another portion of our analysis looked at the loss of forage due to noxious weeds. So there's the cost of controlling weeds, but then there's also the impact of those weeds in terms of decreasing forage availability for livestock. We had some data from the field, from some other studies that have been done historically, that showed spotted knapweed and leafy spurge result in about a 1.6% decrease in forage availability. And if we crunched some numbers, and the reduction in stocking rate ended up being about 42 cents per acre on an annual basis. And for our average grazing unit size of just over 5,000 acres, that calculates to about $2,100 per year. So when we looked at the total economic loss, so that is combining the cost of control plus the cost of lost forage, we arrived at a number of about $1.33 per acre annually. And for the average grazing unit size across our survey respondents, that resulted in about $6,700 per year for the economic impact for livestock production on private lands. Across our entire study, we had about 640,000 acres represented across our 180 some respondents. And if you do the math, just less than $1 million annually for the people represented in our respondents. So it suggests that these species are having a substantial impact. I will say that some of our numbers were not as high as some of the numbers I showed you in an earlier slide. These are direct impacts, though, of noxious weeds. Some of those other studies looked at both direct and indirect. So let's look a little bit at the sample farm that you're working with over this webinar series. So I just put an example up here. If you have Canada thistle in that 600-acre pasture of the sample farm, let's just assume that 10% of the pasture is infested with Canada thistle. That would result in 60 acres in need of weed management. If you take that times the 91 cents per acre per year to treat the Canada thistle, and 42 cents per acre per year in lost forage capacity due to the Canada thistle, let's just think about what your total cost would be, all right? So you can do the math. I'll just give you a minute or so to do that if you have a calculator handy. So if you take that 60 acres times $1.33 per acre per year, that only comes out to about $79.80. So really doesn't probably sound like a huge number, considering all the inputs that would be occurring on this sample farm. But we're going to return to that number a little bit later and talk about it again to demonstrate that you may be able to spend a little bit of money now to control those noxious weeds to save money long term. So I would also bring up that this sample farm, there are also some leased acres on this sample farm, and if the control of noxious weeds on leased land kind of depends on the agreements in that lease, whether you as the leasee or the owner of the land is responsible for weed control. So that kind of depends on the situation, but it could potentially increase the costs on our sample farm. Okay, let's get to talking about integrated weed management. I always start a discussion of integrated weed management by saying that if you're dealing with weeds, you should begin with the end in mind. So just an example here, this is a white top infestation. And oftentimes with weed management, we're very focused on getting rid of the weed. And yes, that is very important. We want to kill the weed or reduce the weed to a level that we can live with. But ultimately, what we're trying to achieve with weed management is creating a healthy plant community that meets our management objectives. So weeds are getting in the way of that. And we try to control those so that we can actually promote healthy, desirable vegetation. So that's one thing I think is very important to address when we start talking about integrated weed management. Don't just focus on the weed, focus on what you would like to have on your land. There's kind of 4 golden rules that we've come up with for integrated weed management. The first is know what you want to do with your property. That determines what type of vegetation you want to have out there. You want to have vegetation that meets your management goals. This may mean, sometimes you may not be able to achieve those management goals. Under your current operating system, it may just not be conducive to getting rid of the weeds, or maybe it's conducive to actually having the weeds. So I always encourage people to, keep your mind open to changing what you're doing, or maybe changing with what you want to do with the land, and be realistic with your goals and expectations. As I said in the previous slide, promote healthy vegetation. These healthy, desirable plants are using the resources that plants need to live, and if you have healthy plants there using up all those resources, it really reduces the chance that weeds will move in and become successful. Implement good land use practices is the 3rd golden rule. Weeds love disturbance. So excessive soil disturbance or overgrazing is just an invitation for weeds to invade. And the final golden rule that we want to operate under when we think about integrated weed management is that no one weed control method works alone. We want to make sure we're strategically combining our control methods that will prompt us to have the greatest success. So integrated weed management, what is it? Here's a picture of a large-scale sulfur cinquefoil infestation in western Montana. So I would like you to just take 20-30 seconds or so and write down your definition of integrated weed management. Okay, now that you've had a chance to jot down your ideas about integrated weed management, I'll share some of my ideas about a good definition for integrated weed management. Integrated weed management is combining multiple management tools to reduce a weed population to an acceptable level. And I think this is something we sometimes forget when we're dealing with noxious weeds, because we want to get rid of every single one that we have. But we really do need to understand that one component, and a very important component of integrated pest management is reducing a pest, in this case weeds, to a level that we can live with and that it doesn't interfere with our management objectives. So, in the case of this photo I'm showing on the slide, where a particular noxious weed or invasive plant is covering hundreds to thousands of acres that is not very accessible, eradication may or may not be possible. If you're starting with something like this, you probably never going to completely get rid of sulfur cinquefoil, but the goal here is to manage that weed so it's at a level that you can live with and it doesn't interfere with your management or the management that your neighbor is trying to employ on his or her land. Another important component of integrated weed management is incorporating the biology of the weed when planning the management approach. So you need to understand what type of plant you're dealing with so that you can combine management tools in a way that you impact or stress the biology of that species as much as possible. Okay? I like to use this analogy for integrated weed management. If you think about a Swiss Army knife, or maybe you have a Leatherman tool in your pocket or on your belt loop. I know that I'm often guilty of when I use a multi-tool. You kind of pull out the blade of the knife to do everything, and that could be akin to using herbicides. That's definitely the first tool that we go to, and some of our results from our survey demonstrated that, with 85% of the respondents listing that as their primary weed management tool. But what I'd like to encourage you to think about is all these other tools you have on this Swiss Army knife that can be integrated either with herbicides or without herbicides to promote healthy vegetation. So don't just pull out that big blade and start using it without thinking about how these other tools might work better or might be integrated with that big blade in order to achieve success. Before you come up with a management plan for integrated weed management, it is very important to think about what weeds you have and where they are growing on your property. So I always encourage people to take some sort of inventory. It can be a simple hand-drawn map or computer-generated map. You can use a Google Earth image and indicate where on your property those weeds are occurring. But know what you have and where they are so that you can best prioritize which weeds to go after first. And then another very important thing is know what weeds you're dealing with. You can't really start designing an integrated weed management plan that incorporates the biology of a weed unless you know exactly what you're dealing with. So if you don't know what you have, there's lots of help out there. Your local extension agent or weed coordinator can help with that. The Montana Weed Control Association or the Weed Awareness Campaign, those websites are listed there, have some good resources for weed identification. And then, of course, we have the Scudder Diagnostic Lab on campus that will help to identify unknown plants. So before you do any sort of integrated weed management, make sure you know what weeds you have, know what you're dealing with, okay? So let's jump into kind of the basics of integrated weed management. There's 5 general categories of integrated weed management. I'm going to put these up here on the slide, but then we'll go through each one of them in a little more detail. So first is prevention. Those are the things you do that stop weeds from establishing in the first place. Mechanical control, that's a physical activity that destroys or inhibits weed growth. Chemical control, that's a herbicide application. Biological control, that's where we use natural enemies to limit weed growth and reproduction. And then cultural control, that's any technique that involves maintaining field conditions so weeds are less likely to grow. So you're trying to shift the competitive advantage away from weeds and towards plants that you'd like to have growing there. So let's talk about prevention first. This is the most effective integrated weed management tool. We often say that the best way to manage weeds is to not get weeds in the first place. So just some things that you can do on your own land to implement prevention, limit disturbance, and keep your vegetation strong and healthy. Use weed seed free forage, seed, soil, or gravel if you have a need for any of those. Washing vehicles and equipment. So if you're moving vehicles or equipment from field to field or pasture to pasture, and you know that you have weeds in some areas but not others, make sure you're washing those vehicles before you move into a weed-free area. Or if you have someone coming in to do some work on your property, you don't know where they've been beforehand, so make that request. Ask them to wash and make sure the vehicles and equipment are weed-free. Keep your clothing, shoes, pets, and livestock, etc., free of weed seeds. Look for new weeds. Get out on your land and try to find those weeds when they first start showing up so that you can best manage them with as little input as possible. And then education. Get to know what weeds are out there, what they look like, and what might be showing up on your land. I like to share this statistic from the Office of Technology Assessment from the mid-90s. They did crunch some numbers at that time and determined that for every dollar spent on early intervention, you end up saving $17 in later expenses that you might spend if a weed became widespread. And this is a great quote from Albert Einstein: "Intellectuals solve problems, geniuses prevent them." So I think Albert Einstein didn't work in the arena of integrated weed management, but we sure can learn from that great quote that he shared with us many years ago. Then I do like to show this graph when we talk about the value of prevention and eradication. So this is a graphic representation of how weed invasions progress over time. So there's usually this lag phase where a weed shows up, it's a first occurrence or scattered locations, and the weeds are not very noticeable on the landscape. So they kind of coast along there, and then what typically happens is there's kind of a period of exponential growth where that's that point on the curve here where you really see the area infested increasing. And then eventually the weed is, if it's not contained or managed anyway, it starts leveling off. It's pretty much growing in every area that it can grow. So you'll see that area infested start to level off. Now with most weeds, we usually start noticing a weed at this stage when it's taking off. It's really starting to show up in numerous locations across broad landscapes. And what we're trying to encourage people to do is really shift our attention to focus on the first occurrence and scattered locations. So if we think about a great example from Montana, there's a species out there called Dyer's Woad. That's the yellow plant you see growing in the very center of this slide. And there's been a program in place for about 30 years that is focused on early detection and rapid response for this species. And we've crunched some numbers. There's been great data collected over the years on the number of plants treated at the different sites where this is occurring across Montana. And we've crunched some numbers, and we have determined that for every dollar per acre that has been spent on early detection and rapid response for this species, it's equated to about $13.7 per acre if we would have had to treat large-scale infestations of this species. So it's kind of interesting to look at those numbers, $1 to 13.7, compared to the numbers that the Office of Technology Assessment provided to us in the mid-90s, $1 for $17. So I said that we'd return to our sample farm again at that. So when we did the calculations for the sample farm, 60 acres of Canada thistle at $1.33 per acre, it came out to about $79, $80 per acre per year, or I'm sorry, it's $80 per year. So if you look at that $80 over long term, if you don't control that Canada thistle and do something to prevent it from continuing to get more widespread, you take that 79.80 times $17, and it comes up to about $1,400 per acre. So just kind of returning to some of those numbers to demonstrate that any early intervention you can take when managing weeds saves you in the long term. Okay, so enough about prevention. I'll get off my soapbox a little bit. Let's talk about mechanical control. So mechanical control works best on weeds that have a taproot. So here's a picture of a gentleman that's pulling hound's tongue. You can see that long taproot coming off the main plant. It works best for those types of species versus ones that have rhizomes. It also works well for annual weeds. They are not very deeply rooted, so they're very easy to pull or to mow to prevent seed production. It only works well with small infestations. You would not want to do this at large scale, but some examples of mechanical control: hand pulling, digging, hoeing. Tillage is considered mechanical control, and mowing. So when and where do you use mechanical control? Well, hand pulling and digging, again, it's only realistic to use this as small infestations. Taprooted weeds, you want to make sure you're doing this prior to seed production. You've kind of missed the impact of your mechanical control if you do it after the plant has started to produce seeds and those seeds are perhaps dropping to the ground. It's easiest when the soil is moist, and it is also something to consider using if you're in sensitive areas where perhaps herbicide applications are not feasible. If you're mowing to control weeds, for species that spread by seed only, you want to mow when they begin to flower. If you start mowing too early, you'll mow that plant off, it'll grow back, you'll mow it again, it'll grow back a little shorter, and eventually it flowers, but it's growing in a, maybe only 3 or 4 inches tall in a very prostrate manner. So wait until those plants get to the point where they're starting to flower, then come along and take them off. Usually the plant does not have the resources to grow back, flower, and produce viable seeds in the same summer. For species that spread vegetatively, you do want to do the repeated mowing. You do that repeatedly throughout the growing season to try to deplete the root system. Sometimes mowing is integrated with herbicides. You mow to take off all the dead plant material above the surface of the soil, and then you apply the herbicide and you get better coverage with that herbicide. Chemical control, that can be used across a wide range of weed growth types, from rhizomatous to taprooted weeds. It's great for large infestations where you can't maybe do mechanical control, but those large infestations do need to be accessible for spraying equipment. I know a lot of people that do spot spraying, particularly if they're spot spraying or backpack spraying, particularly if they're in challenging terrain like this picture shows. Just some examples of different herbicides that are commonly used for noxious weeds and invasive plants. There are some key considerations that you want to think about if you're using chemical control, and we really can't get into a lot of details for this presentation. But herbicide selection is important. Where and when to apply herbicides, having a sprayer that's calibrated so you're getting the right rate on. Safety concerning mixing, handling, storing, and disposing of herbicides. There is a great brochure that we've produced at MSU Extension. It's frequently asked questions about herbicides and noxious weeds. So I encourage you to take a look at that if it's might have some questions that you have that will have some helpful short answers to those questions. But what I would like to do is talk a little bit about when to apply herbicides. And we want to do this based on the weed biology. And this gets back to one of the basic tenets of integrated weed management. using and combining tools, using those tools at the right time so that you have the largest impact on the weed's biology. So we're going to focus on the life history of weeds. What's their growth patterns? So we have annual weeds. So those are weeds that grow from a seed each year. They flower, they produce more seeds, and then that plant dies. Okay, and there's summer annuals. Those would be species like yellow star thistle. So they start that in the spring, and they complete their growth. By fall. Then we also have winter annual weeds. So those are species that actually germinate and emerge in the fall. They overwinter in a vegetative stage, and then the next spring or summer they flower, produce their seeds, and die. And a great example of a winter annual is cheatgrass. Okay, so we also have biennial weeds. So biennial weeds typically live 2 years. The first year they're in a vegetative stage. The second year they grow back, they bolt and flower, produce seed, and die. So a great example of this from the noxious weed list is hound's-tongue. There's a rosette, vegetative the first year. The second year it's going to shoot up that flowering stem, flower, produce seed, and die. And then the final type of weed life history is a perennial. So these are weeds that live year after year. They flower, produce seeds, die back, do the same thing the next year. It's the same plant doing that from the same root system. And many of our state-listed noxious weeds, like spotted knapweed, are perennial. They come back year after year. So what I'd like to do, again, we're thinking about chemical control here, the best time to apply a herbicide if you're trying to control weeds. If you're dealing with an annual or biennial weed, you will get the best control if you're treating those species at the seedling stage or early vegetative stage. If it's starting to flower or you've even passed the flowering point to a mature weed, your percent control with a herbicide really declines. So you're really kind of limited to getting to those species early in their growth stage. With perennial weeds, you have a lot more options. You'll see that we go from seedling all the way to flower to regrowth. You get some regrowth in the fall typically from many of these perennial weeds. So you have a lot of options. Of course, seedling stage is good. Control kind of falls off with the vegetative, but if a lot of our species, you get to the bud stage to early flower, you get better control again then with the herbicide. If you miss this opportunity, probably the best time to think about applying a herbicide would be to regrowth of the rosettes, or you start getting some of that regrowth in the fall after we get some cooler temperatures and some precipitation again. So let's return to the noxious weed or other weed that you wrote down at the beginning of this presentation and think about that species. Is it an annual, biennial, or perennial? And then also think about what sort of root system does it have. Does it have a taproot or is it rhizomatous? So just take a few seconds to think about that. Maybe jot down your answers. So as you think about the biology of that species that you're dealing with, think about what we've talked about so far, whether it's you're going to try to do some mechanical control or you're going to combine mechanical control with chemical control. Just, be thinking about that as you design your integrated weed management program, about the best timing and perhaps the best tools to use. All right? So let's move on. Let's talk about biological control. This is the third category of integrated weed management. Classical biocontrol is where you actually introduce a natural enemy of the weed, which is usually an insect, and that natural enemy feeds exclusively on the weed. So a great example is the spotted knapweed weevil, there's a picture of it here, or the leafy spurge flea beetles. All right, so that's kind of classical biological control. Grazing is sometimes grouped under biological control targeted grazing, which is the use of livestock that will eat weeds. And usually, people have had the most success doing this with sheep or goats. However, cows will eat weeds as well. You may have to force it on them a little bit more. But you can actually target weeds with livestock through grazing. When and where do you want to use this? Well, you're definitely looking at large infestations where mechanical control or chemical control maybe is too expensive, just not logistically feasible. You might be in sensitive areas or on steep terrain. And time is not an issue. This is not, you use biological control when you're past that prevention eradication stage. Okay, you're looking at containment. And it takes time. If you're using these tools, it really does take time to start reducing those populations of weeds to an acceptable level. So this is something that you would employ later on in an invasion progression. Sometimes what people do is they'll actually release biocontrols, the insects, in the center of a large infestation, and then they'll control the perimeter of the infestation with herbicides. So they're preventing it from getting any bigger while at the same time working from the center of the infestation out to control the weed. If you are using targeted grazing, it still must be very carefully managed. You can't just turn those animals out and hope they eat the weeds and not the desirable vegetation. It has to be carefully managed. The final type of integrated weed management that I'd like to talk about is cultural control. And I'll just remind you again that this is what you're trying to do with cultural control is just shift the competitive balance between weeds and other vegetation. You can do this through changing grazing patterns, not necessarily targeted grazing, but just changing the grazing to maintain more competitive vegetation. Revegetation, I'll talk about that in the next couple slides. Fertilization, irrigation, prescribed fire. These are just some of the types of tools that would be grouped under cultural control. So revegetation, I spend quite a bit of my research time looking at how we can improve upon how we do this. But revegetation is a cultural control method that you would use if you're in a situation where you just have mostly weeds. You don't have any remaining desired vegetation. So even if you control the weeds, you're not going to get anything back that meets your management needs except maybe more weeds. So it's mostly used in those types of situations, or if you had a freshly disturbed site where you don't expect anything to grow there on its own. Usually revegetation is integrated with some sort of weed control method, herbicides, targeted grazing, biological control, mowing. And if you are doing this, you want to make sure that you're seeding appropriate species. Make sure those species meet your management goals. Make sure they're a species that that the site where you're seeding these is appropriate for the species in terms of what type of precipitation it needs, maybe soil types, maybe what elevation you're working at, so that you put a species in there that has the best chance of growing. I like to share these data that came from some work that was done quite a few years ago now out of Wyoming, where they actually seeded 5 different competitive grasses into a cheatgrass infestation. So they just seeded these species in there. They didn't do any sort of herbicide applications or anything. It's just looking at the effect of getting something established that can compete with the cheatgrass. So here you're looking at the production of those grasses. And this is kilograms per hectare, but it's a fairly one-to-one conversion, pounds per acre. Here's the cheatgrass biomass that was in these different plots where the different grasses were seeded. Look at the percent reduction in the cheatgrass across these different species that were seeded. And it really demonstrates how having something competitive and productive can really decrease the presence of weeds on a site. All right. So I encourage you to think about that if you're in a situation where you just don't have much growing out there besides those weeds. All right. Well, if you can think about the concepts that we've talked about during this webinar and put those tools together, I can't promise anything but rainbows, but I can encourage you to think about that and hopefully putting the right tools together that are focused on the biology of the weed that you're dealing with will lead to long-term success. So there's my contact information. If you have any follow-up questions, feel free to give me a call or send me an email. You can also check out some of my research, extension publications on my website, msuinvasiveplants.org. So thank you very much. Have a good day.